The smell of expensive leather and rain hit Han Suk harder than the guilt he'd spent 17 years burying. He looked out the tinted glass of his $400,000 SUV and saw a ghost, not dead but discarded. Seated in a wheelchair that looked like a cage, Amara held a tin cup that rattled with the rhythm of a heartbeat he thought he'd silenced a lifetime ago. "Sir, the light is green." His driver's voice crackled through the intercom. Green for the car, but Han Suk's world had turned a violent, flashing red. He watched a businessman in a tailored suit, a man who looked just like him, toss a penny into her cup without looking at her face. Amara offered a soft, gentle smile of gratitude. That smile was an accusation. It was the same smile she'd given him at the international school before his world turned to ink and blood. He stepped out. The rain immediately ruined his $1,000 loafers, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the crushing weight of the contrast. His neck tattoos and burgundy tie against her navy hoodie and cardboard sign. His lieutenant stepped out behind him, hands on their holsters, their eyes scanning for threats. They didn't see a woman. They saw a liability. "Move along, boss," his second-in-command whispered, eyes avoiding the woman as if poverty were a virus. "The board is waiting. We need to finalize the takeover." Han Suk didn't move. He crouched. The metal of the wheelchair was cold, slick with city grime. Amar's eyes met his, and for a second, the Mafia boss was gone. There was only a boy and a girl, and a 17-year-old apology stuck in his throat. Amara, his voice was gravel. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at the man who owned the city and saw the wreck of the boy she used to love. "The light is green, Suki," she said quietly. "You should keep moving. Everyone else does." The rain did not care about Han Suk's expensive suit. It soaked through the black fabric, making it heavy and cold, but he did not feel it. He was too busy looking at the woman in the wheelchair. 17 years of living like a machine, cold, hard, and perfect, shattered in the time it took for her to blink. He crouched down on the wet pavement. His knees hit the puddles, ruined by the grit of the Seoul streets. Up close, the "please help" sign was soggy and falling apart, but her face was exactly the same. Her skin was a deep, rich brown, and the rain made it glow under the orange streetlights. Her eyes were wide, reflecting his own shock. "Amara," he whispered. The name felt like a secret he hadn't told anyone in half a lifetime. Memory hit him like a physical blow. He saw the hallways of the international school. He remembered being the boy with the bruised knuckles and the angry stare. Everyone stayed away from him. They knew his father was a monster, and they assumed he was one, too. But Amara had walked right up to him. She hadn't been scared of silence or his shadows. She had shared her lunch and talked about the stars. For a few months, he hadn't been a Mafia heir. He had just been a boy. Then one Monday her seat was empty. No note, no goodbye. He had waited by the school gates until the sun went down, but she never came back. He had told himself he was glad. He had told himself that feelings were for the weak. He had spent 17 years building a wall around his heart, stone by stone, until he forgot there was anything inside. "The light is green, Suki," she said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the sound of the rain. Hearing that old nickname made his chest ache. It was a name for a person who didn't exist anymore. "You're freezing," Han Suk said, his voice regaining its hard edge. He looked at her thin hoodie and the way her hands shook around the metal cup. He stood up and signaled to his men. The back door of the massive black SUV opened immediately. His second-in-command, Shinde, stepped out looking confused and annoyed. "Boss, we have a meeting. We can't be seen doing this." "The meeting is canceled," Han Suk said, without looking back. "Help her." Amara stiffened. She gripped the wheels of her chair, her knuckles turning light. "I don't need your charity, Han Suk. I see the tattoos. I see the cars. I know what you are now." "You need a roof," he countered, "and I have a debt to pay. You can stay in the rain and hope the next person who stops is kind, or you can get in the car." She looked at the dark sky, then at the long road ahead of her. She wasn't accepting because she liked him. She was accepting because she was tired of fighting the storm alone. The lieutenants lifted her wheelchair into the back with professional silence. Han Suk sat beside her, but he made sure not to touch her. The car moved forward, the tires splashing through the deep water. Inside, the heater hummed, and the smell of expensive leather filled the air. Amara sat perfectly straight, her wet hair dripping onto the floor. She still held the small metallic cup in her lap, her fingers locked around it as if it were the only thing she owned. Neither of them spoke. There was too much silence between them, filled with 17 years of secrets, blood, and the crushing weight of who they had both become. The heavy gates of Han Suk's private estate opened like the mouth of a giant. Inside, everything was made of cold marble and expensive glass. He had spent millions of dollars to make this house look perfect, but as the car stopped, it just felt like a very large cage. His staff moved quickly. They brought a ram for the wheelchair and tried to take Amara's wet hoodie, but she pulled away. She refused to let them touch her. She didn't want the soft robes they offered or the warm tea they placed on the table. She sat in the middle of the grand living room, her small metal cup still resting in her lap, looking like she was ready to leave at any second. "You should change your clothes, Amara," Han Suk said. He stood by the window, watching the rain hit the glass. "You'll get sick." "I have been wet and cold for months," she replied, her voice steady. "A little more rain won't kill me, but this house might. It smells like blood and secrets, Suki." Han Suk flinched. He looked around at his empire. He had worked so hard to become the most feared man in the city. He thought power was the only thing that mattered. He thought that if he owned enough buildings and controlled enough people, he would be safe. But looking at Amara, he realized his power didn't mean anything to her. It never had. Slowly, they began to talk. The words were sharp and painful. Han Suk spoke about his rise to the top. He told her how he had to be more cruel than his father to survive. He spoke about the money, the cars, and the respect he had earned. He thought she would be impressed, or at least understand why he did it. Instead, Amara told her story. She hadn't been a ghost. She had been a person trying to do good. She had won a scholarship and become a counselor to help people who'd been hurt. She had met a man named Kwon Jae and thought he was a good person, but the marriage had turned into a nightmare of anger and control. "He didn't want a wife," she said, looking down at her lifeless legs. "He wanted a doll. When I told him I was leaving and taking the proof of his crimes to the police, he didn't even yell. He just pushed me. One long fall down the stairs, and the world went dark." She explained that Kwon Jae had used his own power to make sure no one believed her. He told the doctors she was unstable. He took her money and her home. He had reduced a brilliant woman to a street corner, all while the world looked the other way. "You two aren't so different," Amara said, her eyes meeting his. "You both think that because you have power, you own the truth. But you're just a man with a lot of expensive things and a very empty heart." Han Suk had no answer for that. He watched her roll her chair toward the guest room, refusing his help one last time. Later that night, he sat alone in his high-floor office. He looked out at the lights of the city he owned, but he felt smaller than he ever had. For the first time in 17 years, he understood the truth. He owned the city, but he didn't belong anywhere. He was just a king in a kingdom of shadows. The news spread through the city like a fire in a dry forest. By the next morning, everyone in the underworld knew that Han Suk had taken a beggar off the street. They knew she was Amara, the woman Kwon Jae had tried to erase. In a world built on power, keeping her was the same as declaring war. Inside the mansion, the air felt heavy. Shin-dae, Han Suk's second in command, stood in the hallway with his arms crossed. He had been loyal for years, but his eyes were now cold and questioning. He watched Han Suk order special meals and medical equipment for Amara. To Shin-dae, these were not acts of kindness. They were signs of a leader losing his mind. He began to whisper to the other guards, asking if a woman in a wheelchair was worth losing their territory. In the afternoon, a black car pulled up the gates. It did not belong to Han Suk. An intermediary from a rival faction stepped out. He brought a simple message from Kwon Jae. "Give the woman back, and we will have peace. Keep her, and we will burn everything you own." Han Suk did not hesitate. He did not even sit down to talk. He walked up to the messenger, his neck tattoos dark against his white shirt, and spoke only 5 words. "Tell him to come try." Then he had his men throw the messenger out of the gates. It was a brief and brutal answer, the kind Han Suk was famous for. But as the car sped away, the guards did not cheer. They looked at each other with worried faces. The cracks in the organization were getting wider. Amara saw it all from the large glass windows of the guest room. She was a counselor. She knew how to read the tension in a room. She knew that the men outside her door didn't see a person. They saw a target. When Han Suk entered her room later that evening, she was waiting for him. "You need to be honest with me," she said. She didn't look at the expensive food he brought. She looked straight into his eyes. "I know who Convoy is. I know what he does to people who stand in his way. What is this costing you, Suki?" Han Suk sat in the chair across from her. He tried to look like the boss again, calm and untouchable. "It costs me nothing," he said. "I own this city. No one tells me who I can or cannot keep in my house." "Don't lie to me," Amara snapped. "Your men are looking at me like I am a ticking bomb. Your partner is already planning to replace you. You are risking your empire for someone you haven't seen in 17 years. Why?" "I told you," he said, his voice tightening. "I am paying a debt. I don't treat my life like a math problem. Amara, there is no cost. There is only what I choose to do." Amara shook her head. She refused to accept his easy answer. She saw the way his hand gripped the arm of the chair. She saw the stress he tried to hide behind his golden hair and expensive suits. "Is that all I am?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A debt to be paid? Or a way for you to prove you're still the strongest man in the room?" She leaned forward in her wheelchair, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of the boy she once knew. "Did you bring me here because you actually care, or because I'm just a puzzle you couldn't walk away from?" Han Suk opened his mouth to answer, but for the first time in his life, the words wouldn't come. He left the room in silence, the question following him down the long, cold hallway. The mansion became a place of quiet, rhythmic sounds. Every afternoon, a therapist arrived to work with Amara in the sunroom. Han Suk did not join them. Instead, he stood in the shadows of the hallway, leaning against the doorframe. He watched her struggle to move her legs, her face tight with effort and sweat. He never entered the room, but he never quite left it either. He watched her fight for every inch of progress, realizing that her strength was different from his. His strength was built on making others afraid. Hers was built on refusing to give up on herself. One night, the rain returned, tapping softly against the glass. Han Suk found Amara in the library, staring at a shelf of books she couldn't reach. He moved to help her, but she snapped at him to stop. "I am not a child, Suki," she said, her voice sharp in the quiet room. "I don't need you to be my hands and feet. I need to know why I am really here." "I am trying to keep you safe," he replied, his voice low. "Safe?" Amara laughed, but it was a sad sound. "You want to control me, just like Convoy did. You think because you saved me from rain, you own my choices. You want to be the hero, but you're just a man who likes to have things in their place." The argument was loud at first, filled with years of hidden anger. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the shouting stopped. They began to talk about the night 17 years ago, the night the stars went out. "I didn't want to leave," Amara whispered, looking at her hands. "My father was a good man, but he made a mistake. He borrowed money from a group of men who didn't care about lives. He borrowed from your father's organization." Han Suk felt the air leave his lungs. He had been a teenager then, just starting to learn the family business. He had been proud of his name. He hadn't realized his name was a poison to the people he loved. "My parents found out you were part of that world," she continued. "They saw you becoming a blade. They packed our bags in the middle of the night because they were terrified. They didn't move to save our money. They moved to save me from you. They knew that if I stayed, I would eventually be crushed by the life you were choosing." The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. Han Suk looked at his tattoos, his expensive watch, and the ring on his finger that stood for his rank. He had spent his whole life trying to be the most powerful man in the room, but he had lost his only friend because of it before he even turned 18. "I spent years crying for the boy you were," Amara said, her eyes wet. "I missed the boy who talked about the stars. But I don't know what to do with the man you are now. You are built from the very things that destroyed my family. Han Suk didn't say anything. He couldn't. He turned and walked away from the doorway, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He didn't walk away because he was angry. He walked away because the pain in his chest was more terrifying than any war Kwon Jae could start. He had finally found her, only to realize he'd been the villain in her story all along. The peace of the mansion was shattered by a sound that Han Suk knew too well, the sharp crack of a high-powered rifle. It happened during Amara's afternoon session, in the sunroom. The bullet tore through the thick glass, missing Amara's head by only an inch and lodging itself in the far wall. Dust and glass shards rained down on her like deadly snow. Han Suk was in the room before the glass had even finished falling. He threw his body over her wheelchair, shielding her with his own chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't care about the second shot. He only cared that she was still breathing. Outside, his guards scrambled, their heavy boots thumping on the grass as they hunted for Shooter. But the attacker was already gone. This wasn't a kidnapping attempt. Kwon Jae wasn't trying to take her back anymore. He was trying to kill her. The response from Han Suk was like a storm. Within an hour, he had tripled the guards and sent his hit squads into the city to tear down every business owned by Kwon Jae. He moved with a cold, terrifying speed, burning bridges and breaking rules. But while he fought the war outside, a different war was starting inside his own walls. Later that evening, Han Suk sat at the long wooden table in his war room. Shin-Dae stood across from him, his face like a mask of stone. The other lieutenants stayed quiet, their eyes darting between the two men. "This is a mistake, boss," Shin-Dae said, his voice flat and cold. "Kwon Jae is a small problem, but he is making us look weak. The other families are watching. They see you risking our soldiers and our money for one woman, a woman who cannot even walk." Han Suk's jaw tightened. "She is not a distraction. She is under my protection." "She is a vulnerability," Shin-Dae countered, leaning over the table. "The smart move, the move you would have made a month ago, is to return her, broker a peace deal. We give him what he wants, and the shooting stops. We preserve the empire. That is how we survive." For the first time in his career, Han Suk didn't think about the empire. He didn't think about the money or the territory. He thought about the way Amara had looked with glass in her hair, and the way her family had fled 17 years ago to save her from men just like him. "No," Han Suk said. It wasn't a shout, it was a growl. "We don't give her back. Ever. If the empire falls because I won't hand a woman over to be murdered, then let it burn." The silence that followed was a physical thing. The bond of trust between Han Suk and his second-in-command snapped right there in the light of the overhead lamps. Shin-Dae straightened his suit jacket, gave a small, disrespectful nod, and walked out. Amara had been watching from the doorway, hidden by the shadows. She had heard every word. She had seen Han Suk choose her over his life's work. She felt a strange, shaky feeling in her chest. It wasn't because she was a damsel who needed a hero. It was because in a world that had always traded her away or pushed her down, someone had finally decided she was worth more than a kingdom. When the room cleared, Han Suk stayed in his chair, his head in his hands. Amara rolled her chair forward, the wheels quiet on the carpet. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, and for a second, the tattoos on his hand seemed to fade. He didn't pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. They sat there in the quiet room, two broken people holding on to each other, neither of them ready to say what it meant, but both knowing that nothing would ever be the same. The heavy gates of the mansion opened for a visitor who did not carry a gun. Dr. Yemi, a woman with tired eyes and a kind face, looked small and out of place in the middle of Han Suk's cold, gray marble hall. She was a former colleague of Amara's, a woman who had tried to help when the world first turned its back. She sat at the long dining table, clutching a thick yellow folder as if it were a shield. When Amara rolled into the room, Dr. Yemi's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. She placed the folder on the table. Inside was the ghost of Amara's old life. Police reports that had been ignored, medical records that had been changed, and names of witnesses who had been paid to stay quiet. It was a paper trail of how Kwon Jae had used his money to break a woman and then hide the pieces. "They are reopening the case, Amara," Dr. Yemi whispered. A new prosecutor is looking for the truth. He doesn't take bribes, and he wants to put Kwon Jae away for what he did to you. The room went very still. This was the news Amara had dreamed of for years. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a threat. Go to court meant going into the light. It meant her face would be on every news channel and every phone screen. Her private pain would become a public story, something for people to argue about while they ate breakfast. Her trauma would be turned into content for the world to consume. Han Suk stood in the corner, his tattoos hidden by the sleeves of his black shirt. He lived in the shadows. His entire life was built on secrets and things that happened in the dark. The daylight was his greatest enemy. He knew that if Amara stepped into the public eye, his own life would be pulled into the light with her. The police, the media, and his rivals would all be watching. Amara looked at the folder, then at Han Suk. If I do this, everything changes. They will ask who is protecting me. They will find out who you are. Your empire won't survive the sunlight. Suk-yi. Han Suk walked toward the table. He didn't look at the files. He looked only at her. For a man who had spent his life being feared, he looked strangely tired. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the edge of her wheelchair. I have spent 17 years hiding from the person I used to be, he said, his voice low and steady. I have never lived a day in the light. But if you want to fight him there, I will stand right next to you. I don't care about the empire. I don't care who sees me. Amara looked at him for a long time. She saw the Mafia boss, but she also saw the boy who had waited by the school gates. She didn't fully believe him yet. She had been betrayed too many times to lower her guard in a single day. But for the first time, she didn't pull her hand away when he reached out. She felt her armor cracking. Just a little. It was a slow, suspicious kind of trust, like a cat deciding if a hand is safe to touch. Han Suk felt it, too. He realized that having her trust him, even just a tiny bit, felt more powerful than having 1,000 men fear him. He had spent his life winning wars, but he was finally learning that the hardest battle was simply being someone worth trusting. The walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in. Outside, the world was screaming. The new prosecutor had officially opened the case, and Amara's name was on every news channel. Reporters camped outside the gates, their cameras pointed like weapons. They weren't just asking about the crime anymore. They were asking why a victim was living with a known Mafia boss. The headlines were ugly, calling Amara a gangster's girl, which made the legal case look like a mess. Inside, the air was even more dangerous. Han Suk could feel the loyalty of his men rotting away. Shin Dae stopped coming to the morning briefings. Instead, he was meeting in secret with the rival families, promising them that he could run the business better once Han Suk was out of the way. It was a quiet coup, a slow poison moving through the halls. To make things worse, Kwon Jae was no longer hiding. He was sending men to harass Han Suk's businesses every hour, pushing for a street war that would draw the police and destroy everything. Han Suk sat in his office, the lights dimmed. For the first time, his guns and his money felt useless. He couldn't shoot a headline, and he couldn't buy back the trust of a public that now hated them. He was fighting 3 wars at once. The one with Kwon Jae, the one with Shin Dae, and the one in the courtroom. He was losing them all because he only knew how to use force. He looked at the map on his desk, his jaw tight. Then he heard the quiet hum of wheelchair wheels. Amara stopped at the desk, looking at the messy piles of reports and photos. "You can't punch your way out of this, Suk-yi," she said softly. Han Suk looked up, his golden hair messy and his eyes tired. "I don't know any other way. I win by being the strongest. But right now, everyone is just waiting for me to trip." "Then stop trying to be a giant," Amara said. She reached out and pulled a folder toward her. "You see Kwon Jae as a mountain. I see him as a man. I was a counselor, remember? I spent years listening to the secrets people try to hide. Kwon Jae doesn't care if you burn his warehouses. He has insurance for that. What he cares about is his image. He wants to be seen as a king, not a bully." She began to point at the faces on the map. Men who work for Kwon Jae. These aren't just soldiers. This one has a sister Kwon Jae hurt. This one was cheated out of his pay. They don't stay because they love him. They stay because they are afraid. If we show them that he is a coward, they will leave. And if we show the public that he didn't just hurt me, but that he's been hurting his own people for years. The prosecutor won't need your help to win. Han-suk listened. For the first time, he didn't bark orders. He let Amara lead the way. She taught him how to use the truth as a weapon. They didn't plan an attack with bullets. They planned an attack with information. They began to reach out to the people Kwon Jae had stepped on, offering them safety and a chance to speak. As the sun began to rise, the plan was finally in motion. Han-suk watched Amara as she organized the files. Her mind sharp and clear, he felt a strange sense of relief. The plan was working, and it wasn't because he was the strongest. It was because he had finally trusted someone else's mind more than his own fists. For the first time in 17 years, he wasn't just a boss. He was a partner. Desperation makes a man like Kwon Jae very dangerous. Sensing the walls closing in, he made one last, ugly move. He didn't use an army. He used a traitor in the kitchen to open a side door. In the middle of the night, Amara was taken. When Han-suk found her room empty, the silence was louder than a gunshot. The rage that rose up in him was like a black tide, but this time it was different. He didn't just want to destroy. He wanted to save. His response was total. He used every camera in the city and every contact he had. He found the warehouse by the docks in less than an hour. He drove through the gates himself, his SUV tearing through the metal like it was paper. He was ready to walk through fire, ready to kill everyone in his way to get to her. But when he kicked open the heavy steel doors of the back office, he stopped. He didn't find a crying woman waiting for a hero. He found Amara on the floor, her wheelchair overturned, but her eyes were burning with a fierce light. She had used a heavy glass trophy from the desk to break the hand of the guard watching her. She was dragging herself toward the door, her fingers dug into the concrete, her face covered in dust and a small streak of blood from a cut on her forehead. She had already started her own escape. She hadn't waited for him to arrive. Han-suk dropped his weapon and knelt beside her, his breath coming in shaky gasps. For a long moment, they just looked at each other in the dark, dusty room. It wasn't a story of a prince saving a princess. It was two survivors finding each other in the wreckage of a war they had both fought. I had it under control. Suki, she whispered, though her voice shook. I know you did, he said, and he meant it. He lifted her gently, placing her back in her chair with a tenderness that no one in Seoul would believe he possessed. In the days that followed, the world expected Han-suk to take over Kwon Jae's territory. They expected him to become even more powerful, a king who had finally crushed his rivals. Instead, Han-suk did the one thing no one saw coming. He began to dismantle himself. He didn't make a big speech. He just started. He began selling his shares in the illegal gambling houses. He handed over the keys to his docks to men who wanted to run honest businesses. He started the slow, difficult work of breaking down the empire he had spent 17 years building. He did it because he knew the truth. Amara would never live in a house built on blood, and he would rather have a small, quiet life with her than a throne in a city of ghosts. He sat at his desk, signing papers that stripped away his power, one page at a time. Amara watched him from the doorway. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, and she knew exactly what those signatures were costing him. He was giving up his identity, his protection, and his wealth. He was becoming a nobody just to be the man she deserved. She rolled her chair into the room and stopped beside him. She reached out and placed her hand on the stack of papers. This time, there was no suspicion in her eyes. She saw the man he was becoming, and she finally chose him back. She didn't stay because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because, for the first time, she was home. The fall of Kwon Jae did not happen with a loud explosion. It happened with the quiet sound of paper and truth. Because Han-suk had finally trusted Amara's mind, they didn't need to use bullets to win. One by one, the people Kwon Jae had hurt stepped forward. The soldiers who were tired of his cruelty and the witnesses who had been hidden for years all found their courage. When the police finally came for him, Kwon Jae had no one left to call. Even Shin Dae's attempt to take over Han-suk's business failed. Without the fear and the secrets, the old Mafia ways simply didn't work anymore. The day of the trial was bright and clear. The courtroom was packed with reporters and cameras. But Amara did not look at them. She sat at the front, her back straight and her chin high. When it was her turn to speak, Her voice did not shake. For years, her story had been silenced by money and power. People had called her a liar or looked away because it was easier than helping. But now, the whole world had to listen. She spoke about the stairs, the pain, and the way the system had failed her. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the one in control. Han Suk sat in the very back row. He didn't wear his burgundy tie or his expensive rings. He wore a simple black sweater that covered his neck tattoos. He wasn't there as a powerful boss or a scary protector. He was just a man watching the woman he loved take back her life. He realized then that he hadn't saved her at all. She had saved herself a long time ago, even when she was sitting in the rain with a tin cup. He was just lucky enough to be the one sitting in the back of the room, learning what it meant to truly support someone. After the trial, Han Suk didn't go back to his mansion. He walked away from the marble halls and the guards. Instead, they moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. It was a simple place with big windows that let in the sun. Amara began to rebuild her life as a counselor. She set up a small office where she could help other people find their voices again. Han Suk spent his days learning how to live in the daylight. It was hard for him, and he made mistakes, but he didn't stop trying. One evening, the rain began to fall again. It tapped against the apartment window, a soft and peaceful sound. Han Suk stood by the glass, looking out at the city. He wasn't looking at the buildings he used to own or the streets he used to rule. He was looking at Amara, who was sitting at her desk, reading a book. On a high shelf in the corner, the small metallic cup sat in the light. It wasn't there because they were poor, and it wasn't there as a trophy. It was there because Amara kept everything she had survived. Han Suk looked at the cup and then at her. He finally understood the truth. The woman he had found on that street corner and the girl he had loved 17 years ago were the same person. She had never been broken or weak. She was just a survivor who was waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He didn't need to rescue her. He just needed to be the man who stood beside her while she flew.